Hey everyone! Today we are going to uncover one of the darkest and most shocking parts of Roman history. We often hear stories about Roman generals and their conquests, but what they did to the daughters of defeated kings was truly horrifying, sometimes worse than death itself. This is not a story for the faint of heart, but it is an important part of history that needs to be told. The Romans were famous for their military power. They conquered lands from Britain to Egypt, and their armies were feared by almost everyone. But victory for them was not just about taking land or treasures. Often, it was about total domination, and that included the families of the kings they defeated. When a Roman army defeated a kingdom, the king and his male heirs were usually killed in battle or executed afterward. This was considered normal in wars of that time. But the women of the royal family, especially the daughters, often suffered in ways that were shocking even to other ancient cultures. These young women were seen as symbols of their father's power, and taking control over them was a way for Roman generals to show their ultimate victory. Many historical records tell us that these daughters were captured and sometimes forced into slavery. Others were given to Roman leaders as wives or concubines, but not in the way we understand marriage today. These were not marriages based on love or choice. They were forced unions meant to humiliate the defeated family and show that the Romans were completely in control. For example, let's take the famous case of the daughters of King Jugurtha of Numidia. Jugurtha fought fiercely against Rome, but when he was finally defeated, his family was captured. Ancient writers describe how his daughters were taken and treated as property. They were forced to live under harsh Roman control, stripped of their status, and separated from everything familiar. Even worse, some Roman generals used these daughters as political tools. They could be paraded in triumph's huge public celebrations where Rome showed off the spoils of war. Imagine being a young princess used as a trophy in front of thousands of cheering people. Your life, your dignity, your family all reduced to a spectacle for others to enjoy. In some cases, the daughters of defeated kings were given to powerful men in Rome, often much older than them. These men could be politicians, generals, or even emperors. The girls had no say in this and were forced into a life they did not choose. This was a way for Roman leaders to form alliances, reward loyalty, or simply assert their dominance over the conquered people. One of the most famous stories comes from the conquest of Macedonia. When the Romans defeated King Perseus, his daughters were taken to Rome. They were not allowed to mourn properly for their father. They were dressed in Roman clothing, displayed in public, and essentially treated as trophies of war. For these young women, life became a constant struggle. They were far from home, in a foreign culture, and under the control of strangers. It is important to understand the mindset of Roman generals. They were trained to believe that victory meant total submission. Mercy was often seen as weakness. So, the daughters of kings, no matter how young or innocent, became tools in the larger game of power and politics. Their suffering was not an accident, it was intentional. The psychological impact on these girls was immense. Imagine being torn from your family, your home, and everything familiar. You are brought to a new city, surrounded by people who see you as nothing more than a prize. Your identity is stripped away, your freedom taken, and you are forced to live under constant fear. Historians argue that this trauma was worse than death for many of them because they had no control over their lives at all. Even Roman writers sometimes acknowledge the cruelty of these actions. Livy, a famous Roman historian, wrote about the daughters of defeated kings and hinted at the injustice they suffered. But his words were often cautious because praising Rome's enemies or criticizing Roman generals could be dangerous. Still, the historical record makes it clear. These girls were often treated in ways that were cruel and humiliating beyond belief. Some Roman generals even used these daughters as leverage. If a king or a rebellious province refused to submit, the threat of harming or enslaving their daughters could force them to surrender. In this way, young women became pawns in a larger political and military strategy. Their personal suffering was seen as a necessary part of achieving Rome's goals. It wasn't just about slavery or forced marriage. In some extreme cases, daughters of defeated kings were deliberately humiliated in public. They could be forced to appear in processions, wearing symbols of their family's defeat. They could be mocked, insulted, or treated as objects for Roman entertainment. These acts left lasting scars on their minds and souls. Despite all this, some of these women found ways to survive and even influence the course of history. A few learned to navigate the dangerous Roman world and use their new position to help their families or protect their people. But these cases were rare, and the majority lived lives of fear, oppression, and sorrow. Historians today argue that what happened to these daughters was more than just a part of war. It was a deliberate strategy to crush the spirit of entire nations. By targeting the royal family, Roman generals ensured that no resistance could rise easily. They broke not just armies but also the hearts and minds of the people. One example outside of Rome itself comes from the Hellenistic world. After the Romans defeated King Antiochus of Syria, his daughters were taken to Rome. Their fate was similar to many others. They were paraded in triumphs, used to solidify political alliances, and stripped of all personal choice. Their suffering became part of Rome's propaganda, a warning to anyone who might oppose the empire. It is also worth noting that this cruelty was not universal across all cultures at the time. While war was brutal everywhere, some civilizations treated captured royal women with more respect. Rome's approach was uniquely harsh, emphasizing dominance and humiliation. The daughters were not just prisoners, they were symbols of Rome's absolute power. Even emperors later in Roman history continued these practices. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and other leaders sometimes used captured princesses to strengthen alliances, reward loyal soldiers, or intimidate rivals. The pattern remained the same. Young women, innocent and powerless, became tools of a system that valued victory over humanity. It is easy to look at these stories and think of them as distant history, but they offer important lessons. They show how power can corrupt and how societies can justify cruelty in the name of conquest. They also remind us that behind every victory, there are countless personal tragedies, stories of people who suffered in ways that were rarely recorded or remembered. Many modern historians argue that we should remember these daughters not as victims, but as symbols of resilience. Despite the unimaginable suffering they endured, their stories have survived for thousands of years. They remind us that history is not just about battles and empires, it is about the lives of real people who faced impossible choices. The fate of these young women also raises ethical questions. How do we judge historical actions by modern standards? Can we understand the mindset of Roman generals without excusing their cruelty? These questions are complex, but one thing is clear. The suffering of the daughters of defeated kings was intentional, severe, and deeply damaging. It is also important to note that this practice had long-term effects. By humiliating royal families, Rome not only conquered lands but also destroyed entire dynasties. Families that might have produced future leaders were wiped out or absorbed into Roman society in ways that erased their identity. The daughters, who might have been future queens or leaders themselves, were denied any chance to reclaim their heritage. Some stories also hint at the small acts of resistance these girls tried. They might have secretly practiced their family's traditions, maintained hope of escape, or sought allies within Roman society. These acts, though often small, were ways to reclaim some dignity in an otherwise impossible situation. The psychological legacy of these events cannot be overstated. Being torn from home, family, and culture, and forced into submission would leave deep scars. Many daughters likely lived with fear, depression, and grief for the rest of their lives. And yet, most history books only mention them briefly as footnotes to military conquests. In telling these stories today, we give a voice to those who were silenced. We remember not just the generals, the battles, and the empires, but the real human cost of conquest. The daughters of defeated kings remind us that history is full of people whose lives were destroyed by the ambitions of others. So next time you read about Roman conquests, remember that victory often came with unimaginable cruelty. It was not just about land, money, or power. It was about breaking the spirit of an entire people, and often the daughters of kings bore the heaviest burden. In conclusion, the stories of these young women show us a side of Roman history that is rarely discussed. They were taken from their families, forced into humiliating situations, and used as political tools. Their suffering was deliberate and profound, often leaving them with a life that was worse than death. But even in this darkness, their stories survive, reminding us of resilience, injustice, and the human cost of conquest. By studying these stories, we learn important lessons about power, cruelty, and compassion. We see how history is shaped not just by generals and emperors, but by the lives of those who suffered in silence. And perhaps, by remembering them, we honor their strength and humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. If you found this story shocking or important, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories from history that you won't learn in school. Thank you for watching.